Welcome! Welcome to everybody, welcome to Edinburgh. Welcome to the inaugural DevOps Days Edinburgh. You are here making history. When people ask you, where were you for the first Edinburgh DevOps Days? You say, I was there, I was part of it. DevOps Days is one of the best conferences that you can go to. And that's not because we're all here, but there's nothing worse than going to a conference and you maybe flown there, you stay in a horrible hotel, and then you sit down for your first conference talk of the day, and it's basically just a vendor pitch, right? It's like, I have a way of DevOpsing you. Now, come and see my lovely... It's like, oh no, that's not what I want. I want the war stories. I want the scars. I want to hear how things went so badly wrong, because in those stories are truths that will help you. So this sort of conference is exactly the sort of thing I like to go to, because it's basically just trading stories, anecdotes. How did you do this? How did you do that? And in the room, there will be people doing exactly the same things as you are. They'll be in exactly the same stage as you are. There may be some that don't even know what DevOps is, and they are here to learn. Welcome, welcome. This is a great place to learn. Maybe there are some folks that are very confident with DevOps and have been practicing the culture of DevOps in their organization for a long time. Well, you can share your ideas, and I bet you can still learn here as well. Before we kick off with the random talk that we've got, I really want to just take a little bit of time to thank the organizers, the volunteers that have put this together, because they don't get paid for this. All the money that you've paid for your tickets goes to the Dynamic Earth, and the food and the drink and all that sort of stuff. The people that have organized this have just spent their own spare time doing it. They are volunteers. So if you give a round of applause to all of these people, to Charlotte, to Matt, to Gavin, to Stuart K, to Mickey, Michal, Percy, Cora, Leo, Cristiano, Kevin, and Angus. So thank you folks for organizing this. Now, this is my first keynote. So I think it's going well so far. I think everybody's, a bit of enthusiasm. I had to Google what a keynote was. And it said, first off, enthusiasm. So, woo, etc. Number two, I had to set a foundation of education so that the speakers that followed me could start their talks on sort of a base level of understanding, right? So I thought, oh, wow, that's quite complex. So what is it that we need to make sure that we're all aligned on? And I thought, well, what is DevOps, right? Because that's an easy one, right? Thank you, right? DevOps is defined by many different ways. People have taken it in different fashions. There are DevOps teams, there are DevOps engineers. To me, though, DevOps is a culture. It's bringing together development teams, developers, and operations teams, operators, systems engineers, and bringing them together to work together towards the same goal. Now, you may work in that environment. You may think you work in that environment. And I'm going to try and describe where I used to work. I won't name like the company or anything like that, but the sort of environment that I used to work in, and then sort of track along where we get to with DevOps and why it's so important, why it's better for the engineer, why it's better for the business. So 5 to 10 years ago or 5 to 10 minutes ago, depending on your organization, this is probably pretty familiar to you. You have development teams. They are developers. They write the code, then they give it to the operations teams. And then they go home, and they have dinner, and they sleep well, and they wake up in the morning, and they are energized and ready to go again, right? That's the development teams at the top. The operations teams, they get the code, they maybe build it, they release it, they deploy it into test environments, they deploy it into production, and then they operate and run that software. That's a very familiar pattern, and I'm betting that there are still companies that do that today, quite a lot of them, in fact, because it's a lot easier to bring all your developers into one sort of team. It's easier to collaborate, it's easier to calibrate, even to compare engineers. And it just kind of makes sense to keep all those Java types over there and then all those, I don't even know what they are, engineering type, put them in the basement, it's fine. And then we'll talk about sales and product and all the shiny stuff, right? So this is a very regular pattern. However, it has two flaws in terms of engineering and business. The first one is developers, well, if developers are working in this model, then they have loads of autonomy. That's great. They're building what they need to build for the company, but they have no accountability. They build the code, they give it over to the operations team, and then they go home. And that's essentially a holiday. Now, I work for Skyscanner. My name's Stuart Davidson, by the way. I should have introduced myself. Nice to meet you. I work for Skyscanner. It's a travel company. Basically, this is it, right? If you go on holiday, you maybe, I don't know, drink too much sangria. You maybe get a little bit sunburnt. You've eaten, I went to Paris. I ate all of the carbs in all of the, most of the 12th. There are patisseries that have probably had a spike in sales, some oddity. Like, your holiday is essentially a reduction in accountability. And there are developers in the development teams that are essentially on holiday. They have no accountability for the work that they do. They give it over to operations. And every so often, if it gets through the various levels of triage and the operations teams genuinely can't fix it, then maybe they'll be disturbed. You're essentially paying people to be on holiday, right? However, on the flip side, those poor operations teams, maybe there's a little bit of bias coming in here. I don't know if you can tell, sorry, maybe where I work. Those poor operations folks, they have all the responsibility of running that code, but absolutely none of the control, okay? They are asked to run this software regardless of what state it looks like. Even sort of the basic psychology books, they talk about how stress works, and it's essentially that equation, right? If you have responsibility for something, and yet you don't have any control over it, then in certain circumstances, that is basically just stress. That's the equation of what stress is. So the job spec of an operations person, the systems admin, is stress, right? You can just put it in one word on a doc, send it out. Would you like to be under stress for the whole of your career, right? That's not great for the engineer. I mean, for a variety of medical reasons, as we're all aware, but also it's not great for the business because you're handing over the responsibility of running software, scaling it up, keeping your customers happy, to engineers who are under a lot of stress and are potentially not considering what innovations they can bring to the table. They're in firefighting mode. They're simply focused on answering the tickets that are being lobbed down at them. They're answering the incidents that are happening, and they're not thinking about the good things that they could do and bring to your business, right? So you have two really kind of frictiony things there that to me make no sense whatsoever when you lay them out like that. Again, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but there we go. So what is DevOps then? Well, DevOps is trying to give control back to some of the operations teams, trying to add accountability to the development teams, and bringing them closer and closer together until you get to a point where actually you can't determine the difference. That's the nirvana. That's where you're trying to get to, is where you have teams that are building and running their own code, right? That works at a startup level. You have startups that do that, and then you get past 8 people and it all gets a bit tricky. So we have a mantra in Skyscanner. I'm pretty sure it comes from an external source. I'm not quite sure in the DevOps community, but basically, oh, wrong button. You build it, you run it. You build it, you run it. And that, we say all the time in Skyscanner, and it just helps clarify the entire situation. If you've written the code, you're responsible for running it in production, right? That makes sense. There's people nodding, right? That's good. That's how this should be. If you've made the mess, you clean it up. If you've made your bed, now lie in it. Or if you've made something spectacular, you should get the benefit from it, right? We have all of our development teams in Skyscanner are on 24/7. They write their code and then they put it into production and are responsible for answering the alerts that come in. We pay any developer that's on call money for being on call, regardless of if they are called out or not. Now that leads to the situations where developers want to not be alerted because they're being paid money and they like sleep. And yeah, they have the control over making that happen. And we have teams that have not been alerted in at least a year, but are still getting paid for being on call. Now that seems a massive waste of money. No, that's a massive saving of money. Because if you imagine there's an incident in one of our big systems, that's going to cost us thousands, if not millions of pounds. We would much rather just pay a sort of minimal fee in comparison to have no alerts. It makes sense. It makes sense. I don't know. It just, like, when I think about it, it just seems like a sensible way of approaching this sort of stuff. So you build it, you run it. And that's led to a kind of a split now of product teams and enablement teams. So our product teams now, our development teams, as they were, are now building code and shipping it into production. Now, the operations teams that were operations teams, they are now solely focused on enabling that to happen. They are now enablement teams. And they work on our source control systems, our CI tooling, source control, our deployment tooling, our platforms, so our multi-tenant compute platforms like Kubernetes, running AWS, all of these environments and platforms that allow the product teams to move faster, to deploy their code safer, to deploy their code and monitor it in the way that they want. Everyone's aligned now. Everyone wants the business to go faster. Everybody's aiming in the same direction, rather than this friction where developers are throwing rubbish over the wall and operations teams are trying to catch it. This culture, that's DevOps. That's DevOps to me. You can have DevOps teams. They may be more focused, I'm going to use a laser, in and around the enablement section, sort of space, but DevOps isn't down to an engineer. It's not down to a team. It's a culture of the whole engineering organization coming together to try and make something happen. It's not bad. Yeah, okay, hammering through. All right, so what I wanted to do was try and give you some ideas, maybe some suggestions as to how you could progress your organization. Again, you might be in a place where you have absolutely none of this and you want it, or you are in a place where you have all of this and it could be better, right? But I've only got sort of 15 minutes now to tell you how Skyscanner transitioned over 5 years into a DevOps culture, right? And it's a massive, massive sort of space. So I struggled and I pondered and I was concerned and I thought, and then I decided to reach out to one of my mentors. Now, this mentor, he's been with me my whole life. This someone has been with me my whole life. This someone has educated me. He's directed me in ways. He has given me certain pieces of information that have helped me in my childhood and my adolescence. And I said it to my wife, I would never take my clothes off on stage again, but here we go, I'm gonna do it anyway. It's Yoda, you see? So Yoda, and I don't know if you've watched Star Wars, I'm imagining maybe one or two people in this audience have, but it turns out, and I didn't catch it on the first few times I'd watched Empire Strikes Back, he's actually a DevOps advocate. I hadn't understood that. I missed that whole subplot. But if you go back and watch it, it's obvious now. And Yoda tells us to do or do not. There is no try. Wow, this guy really gets DevOps, right? Do or do not, there is no try. This phrase, I hope, will lead to 3 little bits of information that you can take back to your organization, and it might stick in your brain as a way of doing it. So Yoda says do, okay, do. Now I remember when I started off in management, and I started off leading a squad and I was very nervous about things, and I went up to one of my engineers because previously we worked together on code and it was fine and we were peers, and now I was responsible for like delivery and things and asking that engineer to do stuff. So like, are you done yet? And the engineer went, yeah, I'm done. Okay. And we left that conversation both agreeing that we were done. However, the problem with that was our definition of done was not clear. My definition of done was much larger than his definition of done. His definition of done was, I'd written the code. My definition of done, especially in the DevOps space, contained a bit more than that. My definition of done was about all of this sort of stuff. So let's talk about disaster recovery. Now, if you have a template that you're maybe going to discuss your definition of done with the developer, this is maybe a nice way of starting to inject some aspects of operations into a developer's life. Because you look at disaster recovery, you think backups, you think, that's just an operations thing, that's not a big deal. Are you kidding? There's nothing worse as a sysadmin to get a piece of code and being asked to back up and restore it, and no one has thought about how to back up and restore the data associated with it. Right? And then you start jumping through hoops to try and collect this data in a way and then sync it, and maybe there's some weird and wonderful hash that needs to be synced with the data, and it's all just a massive mess, and you write this monolith, this massive, there's maybe more code to do the backup and restoration than the actual code itself. So in terms of the developer, if you start saying, well, How are we going to back this up and restore it? Maybe at that point, when they're releasing this new feature or this new piece of code, they're starting to think, okay, maybe if I wrote it in this way, then it would be easier to back up and restore. And then you can start talking to the developers about actually them doing the backup and restoration. Why don't you try it? Why don't you get involved with this? Because a backup isn't a backup unless you restore it, right? So disaster recovery is a massive part of what it is to run software in production. And if the developers think about it from the operations perspective, bit of empathy, bit of coming together, then it saves so much hassle in the long run. Infrastructure as code is another one. If you look at, and I'm assuming many of you use the cloud these days, there are ways of spinning up infrastructure and saving that template in your code alongside your code. So infrastructure as code will allow a developer to spin up infrastructure and write code and test it in the same environment as he or she would in production. That gets away from the you've built it, it works on my machine, right? That sort of environment. Containers help with that. Infrastructure as code helps with that. So starting to talk to developers about disaster recovery. Operability. How do we know if our system is working? How do we know if it's not, right? Certain developers just ignore that. It's running because it's not exit code 0, right? That's how I know it's running. That's nonsense, right? There are so many different states a system can be in. How do you know it's working the way you want it to rather than just being up? How do you know it's as performant as you need it to be? Like, these questions are super important, but if the development teams aren't responsible for running it in production, they don't think about that. They don't give the metrics that you need to make these conclusions. And then how do we know if it's not? How do you do alerting? Like, what is a failure state? What's a degraded state? What's a that's okay state, don't wake me up state, right? How do we know if it's not? Oh, keep blasting you with a laser, I'm sorry. New features. So, yeah, we do need to talk about the new feature. We do need to actually discuss what we're actually building. And then education. When's the last time you saw a developer write a document, right? Like, it's not their favorite task, but who needs to know about this new thing? Well, I would imagine the operations team needs to know about the new thing because they're about to administrate it, right? The people, the users need to know about the new thing. How does it differ from the old thing? How do those that rely on it migrate from the old version to the new version? Like, all of that is super important. The communication that a developer has is super important. It is part of DevOps because there's the synergy, there's the empathy between operations and development. So this is the template that I use when I'm talking to engineers. I've written it in a nice Confluence page. I refer to it a lot. And when I say, is it done? I expect my engineers to be following this framework. If I ask if it's done and they say it is done, then I'm expecting them to have thought of all of this. And it helps that actually, when you start to drag it away, hey, the big unveil! That's my definition of done, right? It's quite fun. It's quite snappy. Yes, you could argue over the letters and what's in it, but yeah, it's good. So that's my definition of done. Or do not, right? So Yoda, he said do. He's given us a lot of information about how we can start to get developers to think about how they can do what operations does. Or do not. How often have we considered this a choice, right? As a developer, as an operations person, you're given tickets, you're given jobs to do, and you probably just do them. When was the last time you said to your manager, when they gave you a piece of work, I'm sorry, I don't see the value in that piece of work, I don't think we should do it, right? It's a bit contentious, but if you do not do it, well, if you're doing a piece of work, then there's always something that you're not doing, right? Do or do not, actually it's maybe do and do not. Because if you're doing something, then you're not taking the time to do something else that may be more valuable, may be more critical. And there's always stuff you cannot do, right? Reports. I bet there are people in this audience that are writing reports for people that don't read them, okay? I've done it. I do it. I've got all sorts of status updates and stuff like that I have to write to a person, then I ask them later on, and they're like, oh, yeah, no, I have no idea. So have a think about what value are you providing by doing certain pieces of work? Because if you can grab a little hour, a little 2 hours away from your working week, then maybe you could automate something else. And then if you've done that, then maybe you could automate something else. And you start to get yourself some time to think a bit bigger. So doing not is an option. Doing not, maybe not doing a thing, or maybe deprecating a thing. Stop doing a thing. That is a viable tactic. The other thing when we come to DevOps is developers are starting to take on more responsibility for getting code into production. That should also align with the operations staff not doing things anymore. Right? You have to actually consider, should the operations team be responsible for X or Y or Z? And have a mature conversation. Maybe not anymore. Maybe it's a good idea to let them start to enable the development teams to do more work. Maybe they're looking at how to deploy. Maybe they're looking at how to monitor. Automating that stuff. So when you spin up a new microservice, you're getting all that for free. We're starting to get some speed now, some velocity. Developers are taking less time to deploy. The business is speeding up. We're getting more features to the user. It's good stuff, right? So not doing something can be just as valuable as doing something. And that leads into my next part, the last part of Yoda's absolutely insightful, critical evaluation of DevOps. There is no try. Now, this is a difficult one to get used to, and it's only really recently in my new role that I've started to understand this. When you look at an engineering organization, there is always lots of movement. There's lots of people doing things. They are always trying. You're always trying really hard. Is it done yet? No, we're trying. We're getting there. Okay? And you look at an engineering organization, there's never any space or time to do anything that we want to do. Everyone's maxed out. Everybody's working super hard. None of that matters to your customer. They see do not. They see have not. They see the new feature, or they do not see the new feature. There is no try to your customer. They don't see your hard graft. They don't see your hard work. They only see what has been shipped to production, right? Okay. So all that hard work, really what it boils down to is what you can get in front of the traveler or the customer. Traveler, wow. I've properly drunk the Kool-Aid, right. What can you get out in front of your customer? And so you need to start considering how to move faster. And it alludes back to the do not or do. DevOps allows you the freedom to get your operations staff thinking about how to move faster, how to operate at scale, how to ship code faster, how to enable product teams to work as fast as they want to. And that is fundamental to your business. So DevOps is a massive enabler of this sort of mantra. There's a really great book that's been released. It's called Accelerate. And it's a study of the state of DevOps, which is a kind of a questionnaire that goes out frequently. If you've not read Accelerate as a book, please do so. It's very easy to read. It's got kind of 150 pages of narrative and then 150 pages of stats that I didn't actually read into. I just took them for their word. But it basically evaluates engineering organizations that do move fast against those that don't, and then compares them on the stock market. And there is an absolute direct correlation to those that can ship features, can deal with geopolitical changes like new legislation. China have just released a load of new legislation on their web pages and how the internet economy works. I don't know if you've seen it, but we're going to have to move fast on it if you work in China at all. Like these geopolitical changes, these bugs that come out, these CVEs that come out that may impact your organization, you need to move fast. DevOps allows you to have that. Your product teams are trying to ship fast code, and then you have all these operations folks trying to make it even faster. You can actually make some serious money. So do or do not. There is no try. The DevOps community are absolutely on the right track. They are not only making engineers' lives better by reducing stress, by adding autonomy, but as well as accountability and doing it the proper way, and also helping a business to move faster and get done what it needs to get done. May the force be with you, my friends. This conference is full of great speakers who will give you what they have been doing, and I can't wait to hear some of their stories. That's my one. Thank you very much.